Yo, what is going on, guys? Got a brand new episode of Buy or Bust today. We're going to be talking about Frankie Raye Nova. I'm going to talk about the good, the bad, key synergies and counters, as well as 3 different decks for you guys. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So in case you guys did not know, Frankie Raye is the brand new Series 5 card that is releasing on Tuesday. That is a 2-cost, 3-powered card with the ability... After the next time you play a 6-cost card, double this card's power. This is what it looks like on screen. From reading the text, I believe this is only a single time per game ability, since it says after the next time, opposed to each time you play a 6-cost card. That's the way I am reading it and translating it as a single usage. But this one, of course, that's what it looked like in game. There's going to be a lot of, I feel like, different ways you can proc this, but I feel like it's going to be a little bit more narrow in what decks you're probably going to be running this in. Moving on to some of the key synergies over here. One of the main synergies, I believe, is going to be Agony. You don't see them use Agony in the video because she's already merged with Frankie Raye in a lot of the video itself from the dev guide, because what you see is you see Forge on the board, but you don't see Agony, and the only way Frankie could get to an even power before doubling is if it's hit with another odd card. And so Agony into Frankie Raye it gives you it to 6, and then with Forge, you know, gets Frankie to 8 power, which is what you see before she merges the first time. Another key card I do believe is going to be Gwenpool. Gwenpool buffing this before it can eventually double would be really substantial for this card. I think anything that gets this card +2 even, whenever, you know, a 2-cost card becomes a 10-power card, that's really good. I mean, look at like Havoc, look at like Athena. Like, you're not having to use like Invisible Woman for steps for Frankie Raye. You're just having to play 6 drops, of course. Where, of course, now Athena and Havoc are getting really large power because of Invisible Woman for steps, being able to proc their ability multiple times. Not saying this necessarily is going to compete with that, because it's like apples to oranges, especially with how good Invisible Woman for steps is right now at the moment, especially with the Prodigy line and everything too. And the Victoria Hand stuff. The Victoria Hand Moon Girl list also goes freaking crazy. But this is another just good card that can buff that. And then I also thought about She-Hulk. I'm thinking about 6 drops that you can kind of play maybe with other ones, so you're not just committing an entire turn 6 to play one card. She-Hulk is one of those that comes to mind, that you're like floating your turn 5 into a turn 6. And with Gwenpool and She-Hulk, we will be making a brand new Nova Slam list that we're going to be featuring in today's video as well. If you guys have been around for a while, you guys know I loved Surtur Slam, but now we're going to be using Frankie Raye instead of Surtur, because I think Frankie Raye actually can get potentially bigger than Surtur. There were instances where Hitmonkey really got Surtur huge with the She-Hulks, but of course then they nerfed Surtur, but I'm very interested to see how this goes. That's probably the first home I'm going to be, you know, messing around with. Of course, spoilers for later in the video. Next, of course, some of the key counters we're going to have are going to be Shadow King, you know, setting Frankie Raye's power back down to its base. And then, of course, we have Hazmat, which shout out to Rez for this. He has Laufey as a counter in his video, but anything with Affliction is really going to be pretty detrimental. That actually affects the base power itself, or just the concurrent power, not the ongoing Affliction, nothing like a Diamondback or a Man-Thing, but something like a Hazmat, something like the Winds of Watum, something like the Flames of Faltine, something like a Red Guardian. Well, Red Guardian, of course, next card. But something like that affects that. So when it doubles, it doesn't get the full power. Whereas something like with a Man-Thing or the Diamondback, when the card doubles, it'll still look at its base power and not what is afflicted by the ongoing power. So that's why I'm saying something more like a Hazmat, Laufey, and of course, Red Guardian, you know, turns off the ability and afflicts it with negative power. Another immediate counter for this card. Moving on to the good for this card, though. It's a passive ability. It's not an on reveal. It's not an ongoing. It's just an ability on the board. So you can kind of just play it out and let it do its thing. Like, you play it out, and then boom, if something happens, you play your 6-drop, it procs itself. So it's not something you have to necessarily build towards. You're definitely going to be trying to buff it in such a way to get the better benefit of it having the ability to double itself. But it's not something like, oh, well, they Cosmo'd this lane, I can't play Frankie Raye here. Oh, they just Enchantress my Frankie Raye. No, the main thing is going to be like, he gets hit by a Shadow King, or he gets hit by a Red Guardian. Those are like the main 2 things I think that are going to happen to this card. But it has a really great power ceiling, because it really is how much can you buff this card that when you play a 6-drop, then it doubles that power. And I think that's something to kind of like you can focus on there. And it's a 2-cost, so it's easy to play. You can play it on curve. You can play it a bit later. You can wait to buff it to play it, or you can buff it even later in the game, maybe with like a Nomura kind of thing, or even like a Hulk Buster or something just to merge with it, of course. Next, moving on to the bad, though. It is limited to once per game. I don't think the text reads that it's going to be multiple instances since it's after the next opposed to each time, like I was saying earlier. I believe it's just a once per game interaction, so you can only double the power once opposed to being able to proc it multiple times. And then, of course, Red Guardian and Shadow King are going to be running amok. I mean, Shadow King's already in a lot of decks right now. Red Guardian, I think, will be back into the meta even more. If it's not this week, it'll be even the next week. Like, Red Guardian is just going to really resurge, I think, again, unless, some warranted OTA changes. I could totally see Red Guardian getting back into the meta. Then, of course, it's kind of a bad late draw because if you draw this at the very end of the game, you don't really have a 6-drop necessarily you can play with it unless you did float She-Hulk to be able to play this and She-Hulk. At the same time, it's kind of just, it feels bad. You're like, well, I don't get to double this card's power anymore, so that's unfortunate. And it's kind of predictable. I mean, you can kind of see what power this card's going to get to, unless they're playing more of a Nomura or you think they're going to have like a Hulk Buster kind of thing. You kind of know how big Frankie's going to get, and your opponents can kind of play around that in order to kind of offset the power that'll be doubled on Frankie Raye. Next, moving on to the floor and the ceiling with this card. At the floor, it's a late draw, and you don't play any 6-drops. It is just a 2-3 because you can't double it. Now, medium of the pack you got over here, if you play a 6-drop and there's no buffs on this at all, it's a 2-6, and 2-6 is pretty good. It's a pretty good stat line for a 2-drop, but I think you're really wanting to aim for the ceiling here, where you're playing this out on curve or you're buffing it and then playing it on curve. So then, like, if it just goes to a 2-4, like, it just gets 1 power. If you play a 6-drop, it's a 2-8. I think more often than not a lot of cards just buff by 1, unless you are, like, a Nakia or, like, an Okoye. So you're pretty much going to get a lot of buffers that are 2 or more. So when you double it at, like, most of the time at its floor of the ceiling of that sense I'm trying to say here is like essentially like a 210. I think there'll be instances where you get it bigger just depending on how often you are getting able to buff this card. But even at a 2-6, if you don't get any buffs on it, that's still pretty good for a 2-drop, which, Maximus is a 2-6, and he does well. Of course, his downside is, your opponent draws card. This card's downside is you have to play a 6-drop. So not as bad. But moving on to the first deck, we do have Nova Slam. It's pretty much a newer rendition of what we were playing with the Surge Slam, but we do have Gwenpool in this list now, and we do not have Wasp. We've taken out Wasp, we have added Gwenpool, and we've also added Mr. Fantastic First Steps. We do not have Shadow King in this list anymore. You probably could put potentially Shadow King back into this list. It just kind of does also offset kind of what your combo is. So we don't have Shadow King, we don't have Wasp, and we don't have Surtur. Those cards have been replaced by Mr. Fantastic First Steps, Gwenpool, and by Frankie Raye. And I like the Gwenpool version of this a lot as well, as either an alternate or something you do use with Moon Girl. You do have Hope Summers in this list too, because you can play a card onto Hope Summers on 4, float, and then turn 6 you get a free She-Hulk. That's kind of the thought process there. And then you have Black Swan for your Titania Bob, Kitty, Sunspot. And if you Moon Girl and then you have Black Swan, you essentially can have up to at least 2 to 3 additional 1-drops to play. It really depends on what you've Moon Girled, of course, too. It just helps with Hit Monkey stuff. Like, I think in a world there's a way where you could go 2 Frankies into She-Hulk, or you could go Frankie, Hitmonkey, She-Hulk, and then you have your 1-drops to play if you float it on turn 5. So there's a bunch of, I feel like, different lines you can mess around with here. And then, of course, if Gwenpool, buff some of these cards too. Like, I just feel like there's a whole lot you can really do to get some extra value, which I really like here with Nova Slam. And then, of course, the next one, we're going to have some tokens. This is what we talked about actually on the Snap Judgments podcast. If you guys not have watched that, by the way, Dance and I both were on it. So Marvel Yap represented on the monthly Snap Judgments podcast that we're on now. I think Dance might be joining me more in the future. Freaking love to see that. But this is pretty much going to be like a token kind of deck. You're trying to get your Sasquatch and your Mockingbird or your 6-drops here. And then, of course, Frankie doubles with that, and you're trying to either buff it with Agony. You also have Nico to buff Frankie. Mr. Fantastic First Steps also is a buff card. Fasto, so you have Gwenpool. You're playing a bunch of cards here. You have Merlin to be able to also play spells, to also start as, cards being played for your Sasquatch to be discounted. You have these tokens for Mockingbird. The main tokens, of course, are going to be Mysterio. But if you Nico turn something into a demon, that also is a token. So just keep that in mind. There's a couple different ways. Or your Nico copy spell also is a token for Mockingbird. So a large variety of different like means to be able to get power onto the board and to buff Frankie as well to be able to get some of that extra value for some later turns. Next, we're going to have buffing Rays over here. So it is kind of more of a either hand buff or board buff kind of situation here. You do have also She-Hulk and you have Sasquatch in this as well as two just different alternatives. Either if you're floating energy or you're not floating energy, just kind of two different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be She-Hulk. It could be a Mockingbird again. But my idea here is, you know, Mr. Fantastic hitting She-Hulk is good. Just having that as another just 6-drop to play. You can kind of float around different ways to this. You have Kahori, Galacta, and Gwenpool as ways to buff your Frankie Raye, as well as some of these other cards. You have Surge, Mr. Fantastic, Fastos, Makari, Zabu, of course, to potentially get Galactic, Gwenpool, or Kahori out earlier. There's just a bunch of different, like, kind of setup there. And, of course, like, playing a bunch of cards, my thought process for potentially Sasquatch. She-Hulk could potentially be more like a Brood or something else there. But all sorts of kind of buff cards, maybe even Ironlad. Ironlad would also be very interesting. Ironlad hitting Sasquatch probably, I think, is one of the worst things you could probably hit here. Hitting Frankie would not be bad. Galactic or Gwenpool wouldn't be all that bad too. So maybe you do put an Ironlad in here to get some even more Zabu value looking at that at second glance. And then, of course, Makari. Makari just runs onto the board. So it gives you some potential for some Gwenpool value too, or Kahori. Not really Kahori value because it does run from your hand. But just think of just other different ways to kind of just buff for this card. But I honestly think I like the first two decks more than I like the third deck. Just is a little bit different here with the third list. Moving along, we're going to go over here our rankings for good old Frankie Raye. I think she's a fairly strong card. A good... flexible in the sense if you're playing 6-drops. Like, not a lot of decks are honestly playing 6-drops right now unless you are playing more of the Agatha or like Hela or like the Black Knight stuff right now. They're playing 6-drops. Clog is kind of still playing 6-drops, whether it's like a Red Hulk or it is a Galactus First Steps. But like in general, you have to have 6-drops. So maybe it's more of a 2.5 star opposed to a 3-star, but I'm thinking I'm rounding up to a 3-star here when it comes to the flexibility. But 2-6 I think is fairly strong. So like I think that kind of is a solidified at least 3-star there. If you can get it like more consistently, even above a just 2-6, which is, you know, when it doubles on the 6-drops plate, it's probably more of a 4-star or 3.5 star there. But I don't necessarily see this really getting adjusted. That's kind of why it's on the low end of the adjustment. It's probably 1.5. 2-2 for being adjusted. If it gets too incredibly played and it's like too powerful, then they would adjust it to maybe a 2-2, but I don't really see that happening. They definitely won't make it a 3-drop. If they make it a 3-drop, I think that would be a little bit more detrimental. I don't think they would do that. But I do want to say that Frankie Nova is going to be a buy. I do think this is one of the weaker cards of the season, but I still think it's a good card of the season. Like, I don't think it's a bad card at all. I think it's a good card. I think if you enjoy that style of deck, you should get Frankie Raye, because at the end of the day, my friends, this game is all about what you guys like to play, what you guys enjoy, how you want to spend your resources, because resources are scarce. It is not something that comes across super easily, and we are getting so many cards each and every season. We are going to be running low on resources, running out on resources. So definitely look at what you enjoy playing, or what you would like to play, or what you enjoy watching other people play, and something you want to maybe try out when it comes to this. Good cards, more often than not, get nerfed, unless they're season pass cards, and they stay good until the end of the season. Bad cards also do get buffed more often than not, or sometimes bad cards get nerfed, and even good cards get buffed. It's weird. It's really weird, the way we're doing some stuff right now in Snap. But just, you know, keep in mind, some of these cards also, we're theorizing how they work, how they function, and what they're going to be good with. I could maybe totally be wrong about it not only working once, that it actually can proc multiple times. And if it can proc multiple times, Nova Slam will be even better than Surtur Slam, and I cannot wait for that. But I do want to say thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Buy or Bust. Let me know down below what you guys are thinking about Frankie Raye. Do you guys think you're going to be getting her? Are you saving up for other cards later this season? Like, we may have the best card of the season next week. Who knows? But I do want to say thank you guys so much for watching the video. Definitely feel free to like, comment, and subscribe if you're new. It's been real. God bless, and Tucker out.